I'm Heather Ferguson, a professor in the history department at Claremont McKenna College. I teach courses on the history of Islam, the development of empires in the medieval and early modern Middle East, and the consequences of colonialism and nation building for those who live in the region today. Today, I want to talk about a book that startled me into an embarrassing realization. While I've always been committed to inserting the voices, often silenced in traditional narratives of history, into my own research and teaching, this book made me aware that I too participated in a process of silencing when reflecting on the emergence and development of the Black Lives Movement in the past few years. So, what is the book and the silenced history that it reveals? Sylvia Chan-Malik's book, Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam, powerfully demonstrates that we should not forget or silence two things. First, that the fundamental character of Islam in the United States during the 20th and 21st centuries was shaped by Black lives and the cultural politics of Blackness. Here, Chan-Malik also argues that Islam as a religion in the US must be understood as a historical experience, not just a set of beliefs, and that this experience is in large part defined by race. And second, Chan-Malik demonstrates that often, even when Blackness and Islam are linked together, women's experiences, and perhaps more importantly, their role in shaping their religious communities and the social and political dynamics around them, tend to be ignored or marginalized. With this point, Chan-Malik seeks to correct the default image for anyone that does link Blackness and Islam. That is the hyper-masculinity of the Nation of Islam and the powerful figure of Malcolm X. Chan-Malik responds to these silences, erasure of Islam from the politics of Blackness and the erasure of women from discussions concerning American Islam, by writing a book that puts women of color at the center of our understanding of the historical experience of American Islam. Let's take a moment and follow her argument to see what happens with this effort to challenge silences in how we talk about history and the politics of race in the American experience. Chan-Malik shows that if we censor women of color's experiences in this way, then we are immediately confronted with the fact that in order to talk about being Muslim in America, we must take into account how race, gender, religious ideas, and social and political structures in combination shape not only the lives of Black Muslims, but also our own paths through the world. How does she do this? Well, this is another reason why this book remains one of the most powerful texts I've read in the past few years. Perhaps many of you have heard the word interdisciplinarity thrown around. It appears on college websites, and syllabi, in conference rooms, and certainly in the blurbs of many recently published books. But what exactly does this mean? What does it entail to conduct an interdisciplinary research project or write a book based on interdisciplinary methodologies? Well, Chan-Malik can show you. Each chapter of the book relies on a different research method, and these research methods become part of her ability to show rather than silence Blackness and women of color, and to then argue how both showing and removing against silencing are essential to our understanding of race in America. She moves from photographs to defunct magazines, underexplored archives, oral histories, and biographical sketches to argue that since the 1920s, women of color, and especially Black women, used Islam to adopt a form of persistent againstness towards systemic racism and cultural patriarchy. The first chapter starts with a 1923 photograph of 4 Black Muslim women in the Ahmadiyya movement, the earliest major US Muslim organization. Let me pause here. Has anyone even heard of the Ahmadiyya movement? Well, I learned how problematic that potential ignorance can be, given how the voices of this movement powerfully shaped demands during the civil rights era and served as the original basis for the Nation of Islam. So, to fill in the gaps for us all, the Ahmadiyya movement was a missionary movement organized in India in the late 19th century. Mufti Muhammad Sadiq arrived in New York in 1920 and quickly spread his message to Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Missouri, Indiana, then beyond. His message focused on three things within the US: that Islam espouses an ethos of egalitarianism, that people of color in the US were in crisis and experiencing extreme persecution, and that Islam could be a safe harbor for them to weather the storm of discrimination. As you can imagine, this was a very powerful and even revolutionary message for 1920s America. There are surprises in the book as well. For example, when she turns to Bessie Smith's 1923 ballad, Chicago Bound Blues, to imagine what often unhistoricized Black women experienced and saw. She seeks a visual reversal of the image of the photograph and discussed how Islam provided an alternative framework from within which women could act against experiences of racial violence, class imbalances, patriarchal norms that increased the precarious existence of Black women, and even against the Black Christian dominance that often organized Black lives and bodies in the urban North. This chapter and the new historical baseline of the 1920s and the Ahmadiyya movement for our understanding of the history of Islam in America then leads to a strikingly different image of Black women in the civil rights era. She offers careful analysis of how mainstream media sources of the Nation of Islam in the 1950s and 60s, and shows how it erases the work of women in the movement and in their daily lives. She uses oral histories and archives to provide two counter stories of what she labels domestic insurgency, the work of women in the home transformed into political work that took up the Ahmadiyya message of safe harbor and defined it as the active agency of Black Muslim women. With examples of Betty Shabazz, wife of civil rights leader Malcolm X, and Dakota Staton, former wife of jazz trumpeter Talib Dawood, Chan-Malik shows how these women defined family security as an anti-racist stance. And simply by participating in storytelling of the women whose lives are often in shadow to the public figures of the men they married, she also reminds us of how not only media biases, but also the choices we make when constructing historical narratives can participate in erasure. And then, if we continue to follow both the different methodologies Chan-Malik adopts and the stories she is able to tell as a result, the next move in the book is perhaps the most significant for my own research and teaching. Chan-Malik takes on the Iranian Revolution and the role this revolution played in cementing a race-based Islamophobia in the United States. But here, she forces us to reckon with the moment in which Blackness was once again erased from Islam, as the media turned toward brown bodies and introduced new stereotypes concerning the veil and the oppression of women in Islam. Here, her focus is surprisingly not on these stereotypes and the complicated discourse of the veil and how it has been used to obfuscate racist policies toward the region, although she certainly provides an excellent summary of how these developed. Rather, Chan-Malik takes up second wave international feminism and the misguided effort of key figures like Kate Millett, who visited Iran during the 1979 revolutionary moment to connect with global women. Many scholars, perhaps the most famous among them, Bell Hooks, have critiqued the way in which this white internationalism reproduces and reinforces a neo-colonialist rhetoric of exceptionalism and adopts a white savior rhetoric as well. But Chan-Malik has led us toward a different point, that this reach by white international feminists toward Muslim women in Iran purposefully ignored Black Muslim women at home who, since the 1920s, had practiced Islam as part of an active insurgency against race and gender-based hierarchies. In other words, the exoticization of the East that gained new momentum in the 1980s and beyond not only misrepresented modern lives in the Middle East, but it also ignored and thus further destabilized Black lives in the United States. And then, in the final section of the book, Chan-Malik reminds us that Blackness and Islam should never be understood as absolutes. With oral histories of 5 living US Muslim women identified as Arab, Latina, South Asian, and African American, she tells a different version of the story of Islam. These women all identify as Muslim feminists, but they also challenge our understanding of both what it means to be Muslim and what it means to be a feminist. The voices that conclude the book thus lead us toward multiplicity rather than singularity, even as these voices are also united in that they avidly proclaim anti-racist, gender justice-oriented labor that, Chan-Malik argues, connects with the legacies of earlier Black Muslim insurgent lives. The power of Chan-Malik's message, a call to be conscientious of how the stories we tell erase not just the histories of others, but our own histories of anti-racist action, was reinforced for me recently when I viewed images of the Wall of Moms in Portland. A Twitter storm developed around the question of who looks like a mom, and asked why there was not similar media praise concerning the past Army of Moms, a group of Black women united against gun violence in Chicago, and in the same city, the March of Moms, organized by Black and Latinx communities a week before the Wall of Moms movement. Chan-Malik would ask us to think about these developments in two ways. First, to note the active agency adopted by Black and brown bodies and the different labels adopted. So the March and Army versus Wall of Moms rhetoric, as they seek to disrupt and transform. But perhaps more importantly, note how easy it is for us to erase Black and brown bodies from the work of women and from our understanding of motherhood. I have found myself thinking back to Chan-Malik's book consistently ever since I read it 2 years ago, because she reminds us that the choices we make when we tell stories and write histories have consequences. She urges us to be more conscientious about how these choices also serve to erase the stories of others, and most profoundly, argues that these stories of others are also our own.